Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to Governing Intimacies in Lockdown. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Srila Roy and I'm an Associate Professor of Sociology at Wits University here in Johannesburg, where I run a research project which is called Governing Intimacies. So we started this webinar series back in July, I think it was. And by we, I mean Nehama and Kayo, who I'm going to introduce to you in a moment. Basically as an extension of the work and the life of the project under these really unusual circumstances. And so what the series has been doing has been curating a series of conversations, primarily with scholars in India and South Africa, which is the primary sites of the project, to talk about a range of issues. And obviously the pandemic and the conditions of lockdown was a way into those conversations, but I think it's fair to say that the conversations have really gone beyond beyond that remit. I have actually put a little link in the chat function, which is a link to our YouTube channel that has all the prior recorded versions of all the previous webinars. So this is our final session, quite sadly, because actually the series has been incredibly successful. And in today's session, we wanted to go slightly beyond the remit of these two primary locales and to kind of broaden our intellectual horizon, conversation, and indeed our political commitment to the Global South more broadly. We're joined this afternoon by three incredible feminist scholars who I had the privilege of meeting in the course of this project. In fact, last year, and almost to the date, I was in Beirut, and at the start of the year, I was in Rio, and in between in Maputo, as Kayo knows. And in all these different places, I'm always struck by, the deep resonances, both in terms of, the political context, of course, but also the intellectual dispositions given where I come from, which is India, and where I'm currently located, South Africa. And I say I'm struck because one is only surprised because one is so oriented towards the north, irrespective of where one is located, right? And I think because of that, we miss what is most obvious, which is these far more obvious transnational linkages, histories, and indeed epistemological dispositions. And I think Nehama has said this time and time again on the Governing Intimacies project that even in conversation just between South African and Indian scholars, she's always struck by how much we have in common, and that's so obvious, and yet we have never found ourselves in those spaces before, or not as naturally as we would be in spaces with Northern scholars. So part of the idea for this final session for us to think, I think, a little more intentionally about what it means to do this work, right? To have these conversations, to build these collaborations, to think transnationally or think in a decolonized mode. And as the framing of the session suggests, to build epistemic communities and infrastructures in and across the South. Okay, so let me just introduce our speakers to you, and they will speak in the order I introduced them. Andréa Gill is a professor and research practitioner at PUC, Rio. She holds a doctorate from the University of Victoria and is a postdoctoral researcher in a project that we're both part of, and which some of whom have joined today, which is really, really fantastic. Thank you so much for being here, which is the GlobalGRACE project. I can actually share a little link at the bottom for those of you who might want to know a little bit more about the project, which works out of the UK. And Andrea has been thinking for, I think, quite a long time about these questions of decolonizing projects, possibilities with various other scholars in Brazil, and I hope that's something she's going to talk about today. Sara Mourad is an assistant professor of media studies at the American University of Beirut, where she co-directs the Women and Gender Studies program with Kathryn. Her research focuses on the politics of feminism and sexual deviance in contemporary Arab media, social movements, and public cultures. In 2018, she was a global visiting scholar at NYU, and she's written for a number of media platforms, Sara, your latest piece after the explosion was really, really powerful. And I've shared it on Twitter, but I'm going to put a link here again, because I think it needs to be read over and over again, actually. Our final speaker is Kathryn Maude, who's an assistant professor of women and gender studies also at the American University of Beirut, where with Sara, she co-directs this very fabulous women's and gender studies initiative. Her research focuses on women and writing in the early Middle Ages, and she also has research and teaching interests in gender theory and science fiction. Her book, Addressing Women in Early Medieval Religious Texts, is forthcoming next year. Congratulations, Kat. So our format is going to be a little different today. 3 of the speakers will speak for no more than 5 minutes, just to talk a little bit about your own personal intellectual trajectories, current research projects, however you want to speak to our central theme, as it were. And then I will pose some comments, some questions, which will be an opportunity, for all of you to really talk to one another, and then we'll open up to the Q&A. Our Q&A will be very ably handled by Kayo Arusho and Nehama Brody, who have been curating this series with me and who have been really the force that has fueled it right from day one. They're going to, as ever, collect the questions from you. So please, if you would use, both the chat function and the Q&A function, which is at the bottom, to keep your thoughts and your questions coming. And Nehama and Kayo will put those to our speakers. Okay, thanks very much. Before I forget, thank you to our audience. Like I said, the series has only been a success because so many people from so many places at very many different times have tuned in and watched our little series and cheered us on. So thanks very much for being here for our last hurrah. Okay, so Andrea, would you like to start?
Sure. Can everyone hear me well? Yeah, great. Just confirming there. Good morning. Here from Rio, good afternoon to you there. It's a pleasure to be here today with you all and open conversation so aligned with the demands of our everyday work and political commitments. I'd like to thank Srila for the invitation to participate in all her initiative together with the Governing Intimacies team for making possible spaces of dialogue such as this one. Kayo and Nehama, so nice to finally meet you, and such an exciting project that I've really been enjoying exploring over the last number of weeks on the YouTube channel. I'd also like to thank Sara and Kathryn for the opportunity to learn with your experiences at the American University of Beirut. So as Srila mentioned, our coming together for this chat today emerged from partnerships initiated with the GlobalGRACE network and some conversations as of late to begin to consolidate a shared platform for the creation and circulation of archives based on women's projects for decolonization and liberation on the African and African continent. So this is a project that is in its initial stages of articulation together with my partner Tulip Irish, who's a professor of law and director of NIREMA, also at PUC-Rio, who unfortunately is not able to join us today, given the many demands that multiply during the Black Consciousness Month in Brazil that goes on for the whole of November. So this project that emerged in many ways in response to practical demands in our shared teaching, research, and extension projects, as well as our community-based work and activism beyond the academy. It emerged firstly in response to the constraints that the institutional categories of teaching, research, and extension as separate categories pose to the possibilities of political and institutional and interinstitutional articulation, as well as the limits that this poses to our overall methodologies, pedagogies, epistemologies, and modes of producing knowledge collaboratively and grounded in the agendas of and demands of social movements. And secondly, it's a project that emerged affirming and giving centrality to the construction and reconstruction of memory as the basis of our intellectual, political, artistic, cultural discernment, a call that's been shared with movements beyond our territory. And in our exchanges with the African Gender Institute at the University of Cape Town, specifically over these last number of years, where some of our audience members are at today, through the GRACE project, we've come to identify some shared points of connection, especially in a diasporic perspective, linking African and African dialogues on decolonization. So I can speak a bit more later on to these initial processes of organizing and some of the lessons learned. But for now, I also wanted to situate my contributions today within another process of articulation between academic institutions and society at large, which has been key to forging the kinds of concepts, agendas, and proposals that we've been experimenting here in the movement toward constructing political and epistemic infrastructure, as posed by today's seminar or webinar. This is a project that was born of the University of the Peripheries here in Brazil, in Rio, based in the set of favelas of Maré. I can share the link in the chat in a bit, maybe. It's an organization also partnered with the GlobalGRACE network, born of the Observatory of Favelas, which has been working for the last number of years to create the conditions for the construction of the first university in a favela territory in Brazil, currently dedicated to mapping knowledges, practices, methods, agendas, demands, and ultimately laying the groundwork for this future construction. More specifically, I'd like to bring some of my experience in the formation of what we've been calling here educative networks with my partner, Patrícia Santos, Professor of Education and Teacher Training and one of the directors of the University of the Peripheries, who has articulated networks with public elementary and secondary schools and other organizations and collectives with educative roles, formal and informal, as the basis of a decolonizing project of education, of the university, and of society. At this stage, focusing largely on the formation of teachers as researchers and mobilizers in their own school contexts, and aligning with partners across our continent, notably with Colombian and Mexican collaborators. So I'd be happy to speak more to these projects throughout our chat today, but in briefly situating these spaces and partners in the production of epistemic infrastructure, I hope to be able to share some of our ongoing reflections, questions, interventions, and proposals that could contribute to our conversation today. Thanks, Srila.
Super, Andrea. Thanks so much. Sara, would you like to go next?
Sure. Can you hear me well? Yeah. So I'd like to start by also thanking Srila for inviting us to this webinar to share our experience. So both Kat and I will be talking about our work at the American University of Beirut. So thank you, Srila, and thank you everyone here, Andrea, Kayo, and Nishama. So I want to just start by maybe giving a little bit of context of the initiative we're talking about. So I'm, so as Srila said, I'm an assistant professor of gender studies media studies at AUB. And I've started working on what came to be called the Women and Gender Studies Initiative when I first joined AUB in 2016. So I had moved from the US, and this was my first teaching appointment, moving back to my home country, so Lebanon, after about 7 years of graduate school in the US. When I moved here, our first female dean, so the first female dean of FAS, our faculty, the Faculty of Arts and Science, had just been appointed. So the faculty is 150 years old. This was the first female dean, so it was a big deal. And one of the areas that she wanted to support was women and gender studies. And so it was initially, and it was out of a personal interest and commitment. She's a historian of gender, medievalist, right, Kath? Yeah. So like Kath, I'm a medievalist. So it was a personal interest and initiative, and we had decided that I would start by leading on this front. So start developing the idea for the Women and Gender Studies Initiative, and this was all made possible through a small grant from the Mellon Foundation. So she had this grant from the president of the university, and she had the freedom to basically use it to support any initiative. And she decided basically to put these resources in the service of this initiative. And so this is how it started. And I'm saying this because I want to highlight the fact that this was very much about personal initiative, which is one of the strengths, but also one of the weaknesses of what we are doing. Kat joined the university a year later, and since then we've been co-directing this initiative. I will say that it has been truly wonderful to be collaborating. And so this is one of the, as feminist scholars in the universities, to find each other, to develop this together, to develop this with other people has been one of the most, nurturing experiences at AUB. And what does this program do, or this initiative? So we've curated programming. This is how we met Srila, basically. We were so glad to host her last semester in a talk that she gave on the feminist movement in India, particularly around the Me Too movement and moment. And so we curated programming, inviting scholars. We organized a big conference called Feminism in Crisis a couple of years ago. Invited talks and workshops, but we've also been, we relaunched a minor in Women and Gender Studies. And so this was one of the main contributions, helping in developing new courses, creating a community of teachers who can also be encouraged to develop new courses to give to students, both at the undergraduate and the graduate level. Another sort of third part of what the initiative did was connect with community partners, whether it's NGOs or collectives or feminist initiatives in Lebanon. So developing events with them, helping in different ways. And so these are basically the three main axes, if you want, that we worked around. And Kat maybe will talk a little bit more about the work we did and what we want to do now, because we were talking with Srila earlier, and the fund that allowed us to do all of this has run out. And so talking about personal initiative and funding. So what do we do when you're as teachers and professors were burnt out? This is all work that we've been doing, giving freely, but also the funding has run out. So how do we continue? This is a question that we are thinking about now. But I also, and I know that we will return to this when we start the conversation, Srila, but I want to frame this in a context where women and gender is increasingly being mainstreamed. So we're not dealing in a context here in Lebanon where we're the first or the only people who are doing this. Actually, there's a lot of interest in women and gender, and interest that is not always of a positive nature or of a constructive nature, or an interest that we need to problematize or think about. And this is something that I would like to go back and reflect on. But so I will stop here, and maybe Kathryn will talk more about the initiative.
Thank you, Sara. I'm just going to write those two things down. Kat?
Yeah, thanks, Sara. That was a great kind of intro to the kind of setting up of our initiative and where we're at now. There's a few things that I just wanted to mention about our kind of plans going forward, but I also wanted to kind of echo Sara, and actually I'd already written this down as something that I wanted to mention. I think that the way in which we've managed to work together on this project has been really, it's been very moving for me, because it has felt like a project that has come out of a friendship and come out of a collaboration, and that has made friendships and collaborations like the one that we've made with Srila when she came to visit us last year, and that has functioned in a really fundamentally non-competitive way. So in a way that I think we've managed, I hope, and I kind of believe that we have managed in lots of ways to kind of avoid some of the kind of competitiveness of the contemporary academy. That this hasn't been something where, you know, my tenure file means that I have to be the sole director of women and gender studies, or, you know, Sara's worries about publication. You know, I think we've really tried to kind of make this a collaborative project. And I think thinking on the kind of theme of this Governing Intimacies seminar, I think that the ways that kind of some of the work that we've been doing and some of the work that we've been doing collectively have come out of kind of interpersonal intimacy has been one of the great strengths of the work that we've been able to do so far. And so there are the kind of downsides of personal relationships when they mean that gender isn't institutionalized, but then there are, as Sara said, also the kind of upsides of those interpersonal relationships and the kind of things that we've been able to do. And the ways that has meant that the university functions quite differently, right? Or our conversations have functioned quite differently because they're not following that institutional logic, that there's, you know, a kind of a scarcity logic, which we've talked about a lot, and I'm sure we'll continue to talk about. As Sara said, we have a minor in women and gender studies, and one of the things that we've been doing over the last 3 years and that we're continuing to do this year is build capacity in our courses, with the ultimate aim, talking of kind of gender mainstreaming, to steal an NGO term, of making a gender studies course compulsory for all of the students at AUB and undergraduate level. So we're hoping, at the moment they're doing a revamp of the general education committee, the general education requirements of the institution. So these are the requirements that every student has to complete before graduating as part of this kind of American style liberal arts education. And so what we're looking to do is to kind of make at least one gender studies course, whether it's gender in the sciences or gender in quantitative thought or gender in the humanities, gender in the social sciences, at least one gender studies course compulsory within that general education framework. So that's one of the things that we're kind of aiming towards as a kind of initiative, is to kind of to basically make it so that if we get a new dean, they can't just overturn the kind of gains that we've made within the institution. And I think that this is one of the things that we really notice, like I noticed coming from the UK, is that what tends to happen with gender studies in the UK is that you appoint somebody who works on gender within another department, within English, for example, but the lack of a kind of institutional setting for that, the lack of a women and gender studies department, as they have in the US, means that at the end of that person's career or the end of that person's job, or they move elsewhere, the gender studies programming falls out. And one of the things that we're really trying to think about, and I hope we can think together about this a little bit today, is the kind of sustainability of these projects, both the sustainability of the project within the university, but the sustainability of the vision of the university as something that works not only for the people who are studying at the university, but for a kind of community and for a city and for a country in lots of ways. You know, there's we recently had our student elections here at AUB, and I think we'll talk about this a little bit as we go on, but the way that student elections at AUB are looked to as a kind of barometer for what might happen or what might be possible makes the university a kind of interesting site, in a way that, for example, in the UK, the university elections at kind of UCL are not looked to as a kind of barometer of what might happen in the country, in a way that I think in Lebanon they tend to be, right? And so there's a way in which the university functions in public life that is a little bit different, I think, to the way that it functions in public life in contexts that I've been in before. And the last thing that I wanted to say before we move on to kind of have a conversation is, as a historian and as a medievalist, as we've kind of been talking about, one of the reasons I think I was brought into the project is to think about the historical grounding of the work that we do. One of the things that I have found working within gender studies is that we can tend to have a very kind of presentist idea about what gender studies looks like. And what I always say to my students, because I'm a medievalist and also someone who works with science fiction, right, is that the Middle Ages shows us how things actually were different in the past, right? And so we can see that there has been a change, and science fiction is the kind of imagining of how things could be different in future. And so I wanted to just kind of bring history and bring this kind of long, this kind of long periodization as something that I think is important for us to think about within frameworks. And I think, as Andrea was talking about, within these kind of decolonizing frameworks, this kind of sense of history is central, right? So I'm really excited to be here to be chatting about all of this with all of you today. I'm excited to hear, to have a discussion about what where we're all at right now and what might happen next. Thanks all.
Thank you, Kath. I really like that, actually, the idea not only of our intellectual intimacy, if you want, which is a product of where we're located, but how that also maps onto and speaks back to the possibilities of interpersonal intimacies and friendships, which, you know, however implicitly undermines the hectic neoliberal academy and its logics of the individual lone scholar, et cetera, et cetera. So as you know, because we've had some prior conversation, I mean, one of the things I wanted us to talk a little about was around decolonization and how the concept travels or not in your particular context. I mean, we know that it's had a lot of traction in South Africa and in Brazil. And of course, Andrea can speak to that, but I don't know how much it's traveled to Lebanon. I think it's maybe, again, in India, it's also quite different. But just before decolonization, I also wanted to ask Andrea maybe more directly about feminist scholarship in your very specific institutional location, just as something I'm curious about, because I think very much like what Kath and Sara has said, that, and again, this is a global story, that women and, you know, gender studies has a very precarious location. And certainly at WITS, we don't have a center. We have projects like these, which might well, completely, you know, once it's gone, that might well be the end of it. So so basically, if Andrea could maybe reflect a little bit on that, and then we could open up with the question on decolonization. But obviously, feel free to take the conversation in whatever direction you want, really. I mean, these are just sort of talking points, as it were.
Sure. Yeah, it's interesting to hear how these ideas travel. So in the Brazilian context, obviously we're talking about a country the size of a continent. So and I speak from a very specific location in the south, which is the part of Brazil that has the most support politically, financially, and so on for these kinds of endeavors. But definitely we've seen what Kathryn, what both Kathryn and Sara was saying about a sort of mainstreaming of gender. And with this comes a number of challenges, but it also, in a way, makes explicit some of the different disputes that are at play. Because in a sense, feminism, for many, especially many who aren't situated first and foremost in the academy, many who have their primary political articulation through Black and Indigenous movements, has become almost synonymous with sort of white colonial imposition. So when we sort of say, when we're going to use the F word here, we have to be very wary of how that mobilizes and demobilizes, and try and seek a language that essentially communicates, because that's the point of language, So whether it's through the term feminism or not. maybe to start thinking a little bit about the concept of decolonization, because I think it will re-dimension some of these questions about feminist scholarship in my particular context. You know, oftentimes when we think about decolonization here, I'm sort of sharing some of the conversation with these partners and networks that I've been mentioning, where a lot of these concepts have been generated. You know, we first of all question ourselves about which colonialities we're facing. So before responding, what is decolonization? What is decolonial, which also has been going through this moment of more visibility and so on, we ask ourselves, you know, which colonialities are we facing? What are the limits and possibilities to confront, to name, to subvert, and ultimately remake the fundamental pacts that position us relationally? So in a sense, I'll draw a parallel with feminist scholarship and talk to more specifically the increased traction for decolonial approaches here in Brazil and in the region more broadly, and how we also end up working up against varied attempts at visibilizing, including institutionalized mainstreaming to a certain degree of decolonial programs within and beyond the academy, and with this sort of same looming risks of emptying out its political potential that Sara and Kathryn were speaking to more in the context of gender and feminist scholarship. But to start thinking a little bit about this concept, as you ask, Srila, I think more than opening up a critique on inclusion and diversity politics here for our chat, which of course warns us as to how the move to include the excluded or diversify existing institutions does not in and of itself, as we've seen over and over again, change the basis and subject positions available within these institutions. But rather, I think I'd like to try to open up a little bit for us to think about what are the necessary political and epistemic conditions for a decolonizing project, having gender as a central category or not. So especially, I open it up more through this pathway, especially in the hopes of cultivating the possibility of our own systems of reference on our own terms, in our own language that makes sense in context. So beyond the method of critique and contradiction, which keeps centered that which we're critiquing in a lot of ways, and looking toward methods of counter propositions, sort of recentered in our own purposes, in our own languages. One of the great masters of the University of Peripheries, I already put the link in the chat there, he puts it really in terms of working with confluences. So rather than influences and other epistemic imperatives key to operationalizing the modern colonial project, and yet it's only possible, of course, to have confluence between forces open to such movements, right? Otherwise, other kinds of disputes and strategies are called for. But working with counter-colonizing movements, as he puts it, in the sense of having movements that have their own trajectory rather than occupy a peripheral position in relation to hegemonic or colonial trajectories and terms and conditions, in a way is also a shift away from alterity, difference, and an affirmation of being in itself. So to try to respond to this question of what this concept means here of decolonization, I think of one of the central references of lesbian feminism in our continent, Afro-Dominican scholar and activist Ochi Curiel, who speaks to the construction of decolonized methodologies in terms of three sort of loose criteria. The first being of an action that's collectively articulated, secondly, across several social movements, and thirdly, grounded in a political project of society. So in this sense, decolonial is not an attribute of an individual or a theory, or not even an isolated practice. So speaking a little bit to some of our experiences here in the spaces that Tula and I specifically have sought to create here to experiment with methodologies and pedagogies in the classrooms and other disputes, we've come to recognize the centrality of mobilizing methods that create the conditions for ideas, practices, proposals and such to be incorporated, to be embodied. Otherwise, what we get is a series of prescriptive programs that don't implicate those who commit themselves to dismantling these structures of relations of oppression and privilege in and from their own place, attentive to the oscillating subject positions that we all occupy relationally and situationally. So how many times in a classroom with students, for instance, or at seminars with colleagues, we present a problem, walk through it step by step, to in the end have to deal with the fact that at best people have grasped the sum with apples, but when you go to oranges, they don't have the conditions to undertake the same operation. Yeah, so they don't, in a sense, incorporate what is at stake and what are the dynamics that sustain it. So in other words, coloniality reinvents and reactualizes itself daily. And so our strategies to deal with it require agility and creativity. So articulating our practices in teaching, research, and extension is one way, or across these categories, imbricating these categories, is one way that we've found to sort of break the separation of apples from oranges and implicate one and all in an integrated politics of transformation and across scales. So starting with the base of the educational system, which is schools. Right? So understanding schools not as places of the diffusion of knowledge, but first of all, as places of territorially based encounters in the production of knowledge. And in turn, looking to how to potentialize this in our strategies for the decolonization of the university and associated spaces charged with the legitimation of knowledge production. So making sure that the politics of access are implemented together with the politics of permanence at all levels, teachers, students, professors, so that affirmative action programs are implemented together with curriculum reform, the reform of funding criteria, language criteria, and always attentive to remake the terms of the game rather than betting on inclusion and diversity to undo sort of central systems of oppression and privilege. So that's a bit of how we've taken up this challenge and where some of our ways of thinking about decolonization comes from. I'm sure if that kind of responds a bit to this question, it'd be great to hear more as well what this concept does in your context.
Yeah, it more than does. So Kath and Sara, if you'd like to respond to the question around decolonization, but I also wanted to, I'm also aware of the time, move on to the next question as it were. And I think here also it would be good for our comrades in Lebanon, sadly, who bear this burden, to speak to maybe the political density of what's happening and how that impinges on your everyday lives as educators.
Can I actually, I think the question on the density of the political context and decolonization are very much tied for us at this point. And, you know, the term itself, decolonization, I don't think it has been really put in circulation in Arabic yet. So we have the post-colonial translated into Arabic, the decolonial, not really, it's awkward, it's not really available in Arabic yet, which says a lot about it beyond, you know, in language as a political project or an epistemological project in its context. But to me, to think of this question is to situate it within our context, which is the American University of Beirut. So we are operating from an American institution established as a missionary institution in the 1800s, still functioning today. So this is the history, talking about, going back to what Kath was saying about history. So this is the history of this institution. In terms of the language of instruction, it's English. So already thinking about how to decolonize our thoughts, our epistemologies, we're already very limited by the very fact that we are teaching in English and all the sort of implications that come with it. So that's one. And this has been one of the things, I mean, we have, most of our programming has been in English as well. So one of the things to think of is how do we, from our place at the university, maybe start producing more knowledge in Arabic. And it's not an easy task because we as scholars, as educators, we are very much embedded in these English circuits of knowledge. So the move is not very, very easy. The other thing I want to put on the table is the question of funding and funding circuits and funding streams. So to speak of decolonizing now, when as Andrea was saying, we're dealing with continuing sustained colonization. So Lebanon today is facing one of its unprecedented financial and economic crises. The university is in real, economic financial danger, and now more than ever we are relying on funding. Now it so happens that the funding we receive, and very interestingly today, most of it for gender studies is coming from the U.S. State Department. So it really raises the big question for us. So you have, and I'm saying that the university today is really reliant on this in terms of scholarships to students, and basically the agenda that is being brought in to push gender studies in the university is one that is decided by the State Department, and it is around women, peace, and security. So what's happening today is we're talking about mainstreaming. Mainstreaming, we think of it as an objective, as something we ideally want to achieve, where we don't teach gender in silos. But what is happening is that we have this push to create more courses, and indeed courses have been created for this project. But it's sort of following an additive logic of, conflict, peace, and gender. Statistics and gender, media and gender. So on the one hand, you have these new courses across the curriculum that sort of deal with gender, but how they're being developed, who is giving them, do they indeed actually contribute to a feminist, the cultivation of a feminist critique of feminist pedagogy is, something to ask. And how much are we limited by these frameworks that are provided for us? So women, peace, and security as one of them, that on the one hand, this is the financial lifeline for the continuity of gender studies. On the other hand, who is deciding the curriculum of the university? And can the university today, the neoliberal university we all talk about, this is what it looks like here today. And so thinking of decolonizing in this context where you're dealing with this, on the other hand, we can think of other sources of funding. So you have the US State Department interested in gender, you have the Gulf countries interested in pushing Islamic studies. So at the same time, you have these currents that are shaping basically the university. And then finally, thinking of the kinds of, and maybe this is also tying it a little bit to the political context, the university we teach in is a university for the Lebanese elite. So we're thinking of these universities, they cater to very different demographics. AUB is part of the sort of elite education pipeline where students get an education here, but in order to move elsewhere, to build a life elsewhere, to work elsewhere, which also says something about the kind of whatever we are contributing, where does it go? How is it translating socially? Because we are very much aware of this reality. And then finally, tying it back to the question of the State Department and decolonization in terms of the political context, because I know academic freedom is one of the questions we ask when we think about our political context. And one of the things that over the last few years our university has to comply with is we have to vet any and all people who come and speak at the university in compliance with US laws and regulations, meaning that we have people from countries like Syria and Iran and Iraq that cannot come to the university. So there's really a very big oversight on our activities from the US, which again, and we're dealing with our own complicated political context. I don't know if we have time to go into detail, but there's that sort of overarching surveillance that we're dealing with as well. So these are some of the sort of political questions. Maybe the other thing that I would like to put on the table, Srila, if I can now, is that because we're talking about epistemic communities and frameworks. And what I want to say, and this is related to the funding, that the kind of research on women and gender that is being funded is one that is very much policy oriented, is one that is very much about applied fields like business, like public administration. This is where the money and the interest is, which means that us who are working in the humanities and social sciences are dealing with this challenge because we are not as appealing as others. So the question of funding is important here, but it also says something about the kind of knowledge that we do and whether all this, whether all of it is sort of feminist research or knowledge, what makes it feminist or not. And yeah, so in the university today, because I started by saying we have this interest, there are many courses, there are many people working on gender, but is there an overarching feminist agenda behind all of this? And are we all talking in the same language, even in the same university, in the same country? So sort of thinking about it in more transnational terms would be interesting.
Yeah, I want to just kind of briefly comment on that, although not at length, to kind of agree with Sara. And I think that one of the things that we have been since I came and since we've been here the last kind of 4 or 5 years have been struggling with is how to do theory from the South, or how to do theory from Lebanon, in the sense that there seems to be if you're in Lebanon, you're doing practice, you're doing policy, and like we get to do theory in the US, right? Like, or we get to do theory in the UK, or we get to do theory in Europe. And so it's like, no, we do theory on you or like at you, and you just like do practice, right? And I think that has been something that's been really difficult for us, because the funding streams, we get the funding streams which come from places like the State Department that want to do gender against terrorism. And then we get the funding streams that are coming from the UN, and they're coming from NGOs, and that want us to do like women's economic empowerment and women, peace and security. I was a little while ago, Sara and I had a meeting, and I was like, I just don't feel very secure. I want us to do a women, peace and insecurity. That's what I want. And so this is my new kind of epistemic project, is women, peace and insecurity. Like, in times of COVID, I don't want us to think about security anymore. I want us to think about insecurity, and I think it's insecurity in lots of ways. But I think that the thing that has been really noticeable for us is that we haven't been able to get funding for doing theoretical research. We haven't been able to get funding for kind of thinking about new paradigms. All of the kinds of funding trains that we are able to access are, are you working with Syrian refugee women? And it's not that that isn't important work, but it's not the work that the university is being forced to do in the global north, but it is the work that in some ways we're being kind of siloed into, right? And one of the things that Sara and I wanted to think about is thinking about these kind of humanities and social science-based theoretical perspectives, and to think about whether we can create those from within this context, or whether that's actually something that, with the current restrictions that we have, is kind of not possible. So I'm kind of interested, both Srila and Andrea, to kind of hear about kind of how your funding streams have been working in that sense, and what the ways that those funding streams are kind of in some ways functioning as a neo-colonial project, I think.
Yeah, and actually it'd be really great to have some of, because obviously we differently know people in the audience, and some of them are located in British universities, which I think are absolutely, some of those funding initiatives are absolutely the project or at the forefront of this new neo-colonial imaginary, where it's all like knowledge transfer to the global south and capacity building in the global south. But also I do think like individual scholars are also facing enormous challenges around funding in those streams, or even the push to do very applied work, right? And the humanities is really in a crisis in the UK. I mean, I know best the UK, not so much. I don't know much about the US. So, but I just wanted to say that actually this project and Mellon especially has been one of those, you know, unique funding bodies where you could do something really theoretical, right? Where, I mean, I think in South Africa, the burdens have been around public health and HIV/AIDS crisis and development and that kind of thing, and not surprisingly, right? And so, but again, our dependency on those circuits of funding means that once Mellon ends or once Mellon's priorities change, and as we know they sort of have, then what does that mean for our futures? And that kind of brings me to sort of my final question or comment, and then we'll open up, which is really, what do you see is the possibility or even the role of us actually having these conversations and envisioning, you know, a very near future, well, COVID notwithstanding, where we could have like our students go between WITS and AUB, okay, right? Or WITS and PUC, or UCT and PUC. But how is that even feasible where, you know, we can't even fund our own students? So it's those kind of very material constraints. But also I think just in terms of the imagination of my students is oriented so much towards the North that they wouldn't consider an AUB, right? And they wouldn't consider, you know, I mean, I know Brazil is different because of the language constraints. So I suppose my question is both like materially and in other ways. I mean, that, you know, to talk about South-South dialogue, Southern collaborations, building theory from the South, is it anything beyond just, you know, us just engaging in this discourse? So whoever would like to jump in, and then I think, yeah, then definitely let's open up. And I was just going to suggest, and I don't know how all of you feel, those of you who are with us, given that we're not so many, we could actually just have you could just turn on your mic and just ask a question or jump into the discussion. It would actually be really nice for some GlobalGRACE colleagues to reflect on as a major project which is doing this North-South stuff, to maybe reflect. But anyway, we'll come to that. So first, our speakers, whoever would like to go.
I can say that with the going online, with the COVID, you know, with the pandemic, it's been definitely a lot of cons, but and we know at AUB that online teaching is here to stay. So this is a new sort of business model is being developed, and so I'm interested in starting to think how we can benefit from this in some ways, how it can be not just something oppressive, and how we can think of using this as an opportunity to build more South-South conversations, whether it's pedagogically or in terms of research. And I mean, spaces like these are one example. You know, what this project allows, these kinds of conversations and exchanges. But I'm wondering if, you know, even in the classroom, how this can be, so not just in terms of research, but also in terms of pedagogy, how we can foster, as you said, Srila, to cultivate students' interest in looking not north, because these are the worlds that they are familiar with. This is where they want to go. This is where the opportunity is. This is the reality. So how do we cultivate an interest and an awareness of, you know, to reorient them? And we can, you know, we do this in our classes, in the text they read and the theories they read. But I'm wondering what more can we do to do this shift?
Maybe I can add a little bit to this reflection on South-South collaborations. Yeah, we've definitely been seeing around here increasing calls and sources of funding for projects from the South or with the South or across the South. Projects often with the best of intentions, but as goes the old saying, the pathway to hell is paved with good intentions. And I think the problem that we can consistently deal with in terms of this framing of the global South is not only that there exists many Norths in the South and many Souths in the North, but that it locks us into a structure of relations that's extremely difficult to break and to reposition. So more often than North, as some of you have already mentioned, the South becomes a sort of laboratory for the North's ideas and projects. And the elites in the South do their part in importing, translating, and scaling us to Northern ideals. And often ideals that may not even resonate in the so-called North, but is filtered by inferiority complexes of Southern elites as self-appointed translators of modernity, insecure, not quite civilized enough, not quite modern enough, don't see themselves as quite European enough, not white enough. So if it's not by importing Northern theories and methods, criteria, language, and references, it's by exporting the raw material of case studies and ethnographies and innovations or creativity, as it's often put for lack of patent, and other modes of data production that this structure of relations is reproduced. So in this scenario, something that we're really thinking about is how to approach this idea of collaboration when we're consistently instrumentalized by these systems of oppression and privilege internally and externally, and partnership oftentimes may not be possible. At best, perhaps complicity is what we could aim for. So maybe I can bring to the conversation a bit about the archives project that I mentioned at the beginning, that we've been organizing with the AGI, and Srila has also been bringing VIDs on board, and we're currently conceiving possibilities of this network. And it's a network in a way that I think responds to some of these contexts in trying to build and have as its basis a platform for knowledges and practices to circulate, grounded, as I mentioned, in women's projects for decolonization, liberation on the African and African continent. And the idea is to bring together resources that register these collective projects and authors and initiators, notably in terms of how they're mobilized in classrooms and communities. So in a way, it actually is supposed to facilitate our work, because as we know already, the idea of burnout has already been mentioned, the demands are endless. And so the idea is to serve as a sort of hub to nourish and be nourished by our classroom research and extension projects. In this sense, the aim is to consolidate an interactive digital platform, exactly taking advantage of this moment where we're having to go digital, where we're having to go hybrid, and trying to, in a way, systematize and translate these archives that are already existing, as well as create new ones and to share across continents and languages. So we're currently in the mapping phases, and in a sense mobilizing our classroom practice to this end. This is something that we do quite a lot. So we get our postgraduate students to do translation work as part of their assigned work, which of course has pedagogical value in the sense of having to deal with the incommensurability of languages. And in our undergraduate work, we do a lot of this mapping practice. And in the digital mode, it really does cultivate a kind of more research-based, as we call here, the producer of content, right? So we try to do a more kind of study group dynamic rather than a classroom unilateral dynamic, and mobilize our students to produce these archives in a certain way, which feeds into our research and of course is fed by our research. And the idea is to put this in a digital platform so that it can be used more broadly in classrooms and in communities. And the way that we're seeking a kind of sustainability, to just wrap up and respond to some of these questions that have come up, is trying to seek institutional channels such as professionals master programs, which is where the money's at here, specialization courses, extension programs, in addition to the graduate and undergraduate programs, to ensure a more stable source of funding. And this is kind of reflects a bit the sort of the Brazilian organization of the academy. And the idea is that this academic formation would finance as well political formation, and that our political work with the movements would give shape to the research, classroom, and community extension projects. So I'd be happy to share a little bit more about how we're thinking about these methodologies, but for more in the sense of trying to contribute how we've been dealing with some of these questions, I give just a bit of an overview of some of our initial attempts.
Andrea, that sounds amazing. One of the things that we've been thinking about is to try and create a kind of bilingual textbook, kind of based on some of the archives that we have in Lebanon of women and gender studies work, of kind of feminist work, using examples from the region, because we noticed that a lot of the, unless we're teaching solely from academic articles, we don't have any kind of textbooks that we can use because they're just unusable, because all the examples just kind of don't make any sense within the context that we're in. And so I really like the idea of having this kind of loop of like work is coming out of the archives as part of classroom, and then that's being used in the community, and then that's kind of coming back into the archive. And so this is one of the things that Sara and I have been thinking about in terms of like future plans for the initiative, is thinking about creating this kind of women and gender studies feminist kind of set of materials that can be used to teach this work, both in Arabic and in English. Sorry, Srila, I think I interrupted you.
No, I was just going to say that we've been terribly, we haven't been very disciplined this time because it is our last session. Normally we're like, come on. So, but I do want to, I see that people might be starting to leave because it was supposed to be for an hour. So I do want to open up to questions, also asking Nehama and Kayo to jump in. And like we said, if you do want to, you can feel free to write. I see Suzanne has already written something, but otherwise we can also unmute you. And if you'd like to just, come into the conversation, feel free. Nehama, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I could just ask questions for the next half an hour and I would be happy. And so many resonant points here. I really, for me, two of the things that stood out very strongly was this discussion around funding and kind of how funding almost kind of position, and this is the similar boat that NGOs are kind of in across, particularly in Africa. And in fact, I gave a talk a few years ago about the need to decolonize knowledge, because knowledge is all commissioned by the NGOs, by kind of global interests who want information on poverty in third world countries. So they sort of, the knowledge tends to be biased towards that way. And I think that a discussion around funding would be very, very interesting for these kinds of initiatives, for all of us to maybe communicate more about them and to discuss how we can push back. Because I think it is important that we take the money, because honestly, it should be reparations to some extent, but we must take the money. But we also have to at some point co-opt the narrative that's being asked of us when we take the funding. But I really feel that is such an important area of discussion. But a second thing that was taking on from what Kathryn was saying now, and Sara, and also Andrea, was this idea of language. And for me, I realized that in Africa and India, which are the two areas where I do read scholarship, I read the scholarship because it's available in English. And whereas in Latin America, I don't read the scholarship unless I know it exists, because I don't search very easily in Spanish or Portuguese. And that's a real limitation. And it would be so nice, again, I thought, maybe Andrea, if you also have ideas, or Sara as well, to talk about how could we recirculate those things outside of, so instead of just circulating it internally in your own country, could you circulate that to other academics across, let's talk particularly the subcontinent, Africa, and then Latin America, so that we actually get that knowledge, because particularly in Spanish and Portuguese, there's a huge body of knowledge around our common interests. And how does that kind of reach the English speaking scholars in Africa and in India? And so maybe I could ask kind of Andrea that in terms of circulating outwards.
Should I jump in already? Or are there other questions?
You can, but I just also wondered if Kayo would like to also jump in, because we've also had, and this has really been Kayo's baby in Governing Intimacies, thinking about language translation, but also archives. So I don't know if Kaya wants to just, say something in addition to Nehama's thoughts.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. It's been very, very engaging, this panel. And something that I have been thinking about that was actually raised by Kathryn. I am also a historian by training, although I do interdisciplinary research and anthropological research as well. But I am very moved by the idea of the historicity of all these issues that we are talking about, including notions and reimaginings of decolonization, of which we have several iterations throughout history. So this kind of historicities and afterlives of decolonizing projects is something that is very dear to me. At the same time, as a historian doing colonial history in Southern Africa, it is equally very frustrating that you cannot escape the metropole. And by that, I mean people doing histories of English-speaking Southern Africa, French-speaking Southern Africa, Portuguese-speaking Southern Africa, or Africa in general. They have to go back to the colonial archives in the former metropoles. And there is a huge inequality in terms of the global geographies of archives. We all know them. Archives, they're in very different situations. They have different sources of funding, organizations, and challenges, and all that. But my point in all this is perhaps rather than going back to the colonial archive and trying to emulate the kind of organizational language of the colonial archive, if we shouldn't be thinking about making alternative archives. And I think that is something that many of you have spoken to, and I would be very interested in hearing more your thoughts on those issues. That's all.
Okay, so Andrea, if you want to, anyone who wants to jump in, or Sara, I also see you unmuted. Maybe Sara, if you want to start.
I think, and I mean, Andrea, did you want to answer the question on Nehama's question on the circulation outside of the knowledge, so in terms of translation?
Sure. I'll go now, or really?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, it's a very tricky question because there's a number of, to connect to the question of the densities of political context, there's a lot of geopolitics involved in this question that goes beyond translation. First of all, because Brazil is a country that in its hegemonic self-identity and discourses doesn't see itself as part of Latin America. And not only because of this language difference between Portuguese and Spanish, but because of a whole series of other political projects that also, in a way, consolidate a bit of its sub-imperial role in the region, right? A lot of those inferiority complexes that I mentioned about. So in a way, the political priority, first of all, is to connect with our region, to situate historically and geopolitically in our region before thinking about going more outward. And we have a sort of double distancing there, because in a way, we're not even, for example, reading the colonial archives of our colonial masters. We don't read the Portuguese, we read the English, we read the US, we read other countries in Europe, we read more France and Germany than we read Portugal. And so if we're to think about that question about what does it mean to do decolonization, in a way, as I mentioned, the first step is to be able to grapple with the kinds of colonialities that we face and the ways that the Iberian forms of coloniality reconfigure themselves. Is very distinct from the Anglo-Saxon forms of coloniality. So we have sort of these kind of double distancing. So when we talk about language, in a way, it's a means to an end. It's a means to situate us historically, to situate us geopolitically. And so our priority these last number of years has been to connect with our region Even though we don't necessarily need translation to be able to read the Spanish language work, it's a little more difficult the other way around for the Spanish language to read the Portuguese language. But we have been able to build those networks, especially within the sort of feminist decolonial work being done in the region. And now with this archives project that I'm mentioning, particularly more through a diasporic perspective, we're seeking these kinds of projects that do translation into English language in order to connect to some extent with some parts of the African continent, and with the hopes as well of having support for French translation. So that's a little bit of the kinds of questions that we deal with in translation. And in terms of funding, we end up having to use a lot of very indirect means, yeah. And as I mentioned, what we've been really betting on is this kind of feedback loop, right? So to mobilize the classroom to feed into the research to feed into the classroom, extension projects that are integrated with our research and classroom methodologies in order to ensure that our work is always grounded in movements and actions that are territorially grounded. And a lot of the times we understand that the university is there for us to use the resources. Yeah, so when we mobilize for translation, that will enable other kinds of dialogues and try to think of ways of overlapping the objectives, being able to frame it in a way that will be recognized in the academic institution and reframe it in a way that will be recognized in other languages and according to other values. So that's a little bit about the ways that we have been dealing with translation, language, and funding questions. Does that answer some of your questions?
It does, and it really contextualizes the discussion nicely. I want to go to Sara, and also I can't remember if it was Sara or Kathryn who have to go before 3:30. So I'm going to hand to both of you to talk just before we run out of time. Sara, you can go ahead now.
So I'm thinking in terms of where has this process of translation been happening? Because we're dealing, I mean, for us, the region is the Arab region, so Middle East, North Africa. And a lot of it's been happening from, grassroots, feminist collectives, different, new media platforms. So whether it's activism or media, this is where a lot of knowledge on women, gender, sexuality is now being made available and circulating. And I mean, today we've seen over the last maybe few years really a boom in the sort of content that's available. I don't think we can say the same in terms of the academia and what it's making available in terms of content, because we're dealing with translation of concepts of a certain language. Who's doing this work? So I can think of initiatives that have done this work of translation. But we, and again, to bring it to sort of situate it in our professional and institutional context, we have to publish in English. We have to publish in peer-reviewed journal in the US primarily. We have to make our scholarship available and visible in English. So even if you want to do this work, where is this work going to be recognized and how will it be valued? We don't have systems in place to do this. We have recently reinstated tenure at AUB, and it's clear what you have to do to get it. And so, yes, you have these political commitments, you have these personal commitments, but you have such limited time and energy. And these are considerations that weigh heavily on the work that we do and on the kinds of commitments we have. And so, yeah, I want to bring it back to the institutional context, because I think, think about this kind of work maybe outside of this academic framework and how it can be done.
Kathryn, do you want to add something there?
So I think The only thing that I would add would be to kind of bring in the teaching part of that from our point of view, which, as we said, this is an English language institution that we're teaching within. And all of the material that we teach has to be available in English, because some of our students' facility with Arabic is not, I mean, I have a few students who don't speak any Arabic at all, and the majority of my students don't read fluently in Arabic. They speak fluent Arabic, but they don't read fluently in Arabic, especially in a kind of academic register of Arabic. So one of the things that we've been thinking about is, like, for a lot of our students, English now is a language of the region, right? It's a language that they speak in, it's a language that they consume media in, but that doesn't mean that the English that we read in the classroom or that we kind of teach from or speaks to them, right? So in some ways it's an epistemological or a kind of a knowledge creation problem, in as much as it is a language problem, although I think it's also a language problem when we're thinking about outside the university, right? But within the university, when we're teaching, I think it's as much a knowledge creation problem as it is a kind of language issue. So I just wanted to bring that in. But thank you for,
if anybody from the audience has other questions, and people have been posting some really useful comments and also input on the side. Thank you for that, Siobhan. That is interesting to look at. Please post your questions while we've still got a few minutes, or if you'd like to talk, just message me or Kayo and we can unmute you. And I mean, I think the points that have been raised here are, again, resonant with all of us, and I think that's, you know, where we kind of find ourselves. And I thought what was interesting when Sara was talking as well, and Andréa, is that not so much only the academic location but is actually the kind of the physical location, and how, you know, we find these kind of commonalities. And again, what today's topic is sort of, what are we building from within that. I'm just trying to see if anybody's posting anything here, because I don't want me and Kai to just take up, but we're also happy to do that. Srila, I don't know if you have any other things that you want to add. Otherwise, I have lists of little questions to go through. So I have to find, okay, we've discussed the English. Oh, right.
And also, sorry, yeah, also if Kayo would like to jump in at all.
Yeah, Kayo? No, Mohawk is just looking there. So, okay, we mentioned the funding. Sorry, now I have to go past. Oh, the one important thing, and I think this might take us through to the end of our time, but something that Sara raised in particular was, as gender studies, and I mean, I'm positioning this with part of what Governing Intimacies looks at, as, let's say, this area of study becomes legitimized, so you now have a minor course, it's attracted a lot of attention. So it's become formalized within the academy, and it attracts more attention, it attracts more interest. And you mentioned that not all of this attention is positive. And so I've been interested to see in the South African context, but also obviously noting similar efforts in the American and European context. So if you want to look at, say, for example, the so-called squared attempt, but in South Africa as well, where in fact my doctoral supervisor who started Governing Intimacies, her Twitter handle is Professor of Grievance Studies, because at one point there were a group of people in South Africa, and I mean, she's a professor of politics and gender studies, but her areas of work were called grievance studies. And so I wanted to talk about, without having to locate ourselves relative to the North, within the Global South, which obviously has a very entrenched sort of patriarchal and misogynistic landscape, is how do we as an academy think about managing and deflecting or pushing back against the negative attention that this type of scholarship attracts. And maybe could I actually start with the boss here, with Srila? I know it's not your panel, but maybe Srila, if you could talk, and then the others can respond as they want.
Actually, I think everyone has to respond, but Nihama did remind me that actually that's why we started the webinar series, remember? Because
it is.
There was hectic Twitter trolling about the pandemic and COVID and about, well, a particular event, but basically there was a huge backlash against a person who spoke in an event for having a gender studies background, diversity studies. And it became diversity studies and gender studies, and how all of it was just nonsense and rubbish and a waste of time and money, and what is this? And that's kind of what prompted us to think about, let's offer a space where for people to see how the humanities engage in the pandemic. So yeah, thankfully I forgot about that. but I mean, actually I do want, I think this whole idea of not being mainstreaming, and that's often how I start teaching feminist theory these days. I start by saying, feminism is no longer at the margin of power. It's in the corridors of power, as Janet Haley would say. So what does that shift mean? And I do think it's a nice way to conclude. So let's start with Kath, because I know Kath has to leave.
So one thing that has been interesting, I think, for Sara and I don't want to speak on her behalf, but as we've been running the Gender Studies Initiative, are like the things that we get backlash for and the things that we don't. And they're not always the things that we expect. And I'm going to just, I guess, give a kind of quick example. And this is in relation to the kind of LGBT student club on campus. I think Sara will have been thinking about this as well. That in some ways we successfully created a safe space on campus, which meant that I think what happened was that the LGBT student club on campus were planning to hold a Valentine's Day event. This was last year. And they were advertising it, I think it was Valentine's Day, on kind of social media. They had a poster. Somebody took a photo of the poster, translated it into Arabic. So the poster was in English, translated it into Arabic kind of maliciously. So it was called something like, Valentine's Day social, and they translated it as like, gay orgy. And it was put out onto a lot of social media. It became this kind of huge problem. I had students in my office, because there was a student phone number on the flyer. I had students in my office kind of being attacked on social media, and one of the things that was kind of interesting, I think, for me and for us, when we were kind of dealing with the fallout from that, they cancelled the event, was the way in which the different, our colleagues were both incredibly supportive in some cases and also incredibly unsupportive in other cases. And the way that worked from within the university, that we couldn't kind of expect a particular response from our colleagues, but also that it became a kind of public issue in a way that the students who were just putting on like a little social for Valentine's Day were absolutely not expecting and absolutely weren't prepared for. But then also the way that kind of became an issue within the university and became an issue between faculty members. And so it was one of the things that we were thinking about, is just like, and we've had this with a range of events that we've put on, is that some of the events that we were kind of more nervous about have had no response at all from within the university or from within the wider community. And then some that we've put on, we've had backlash from. So it's just been kind of interesting to us, like what kind of provokes that kind of work. Sara, do you want to speak to that a little bit as well?
I will add, because I immediately thought of I call it the Mufti affair, because it was the previous Mufti of the Republic, the highest ranking Muslim authority in the country, who issued a calling for the Prime Minister and the Speaker of the House to intervene and to take action against the students and the university for having a queer mixer. And I think what it revealed was, to a certain extent, the insularity of our discourses, AUB priding itself on being an inclusive work environment and being committed to diversity. I know Andrea was talking about these new, this new discourse in the university. So we at AUB, we've had this emphasis on diversity and inclusion, maybe most notably through the Office of Title IX, which is, this structure brought to us to AUB from the US. With its own protected categories, right, against discrimination and sexual harassment. So this happened in 2013. And, the university adopted a sort of pro-LGBT discourse. And then this happens, and the university fails to take any action or to make any public statements about where it stands with regards to these issues. Because Kath was saying it became a sort of public national controversy. And the way the university responded was by not basically making any responses, just addressing its own community, which is commendable, right? To tell students that you are welcome here, that this is a place for you. But to bring it back to sort of the public role of the university, particularly when it comes to creating and promoting and circulating these new discourses on sexual diversity and gender diversity and difference, where does it stop? Yeah, what are the limits of what we are doing?
Before we go to Andrea, it does always seem to come back to the students as well. And something that each of you have highlighted in different ways is the importance of the students. And sometimes when we're talking in the realm of theory and framework, it's easy to think that it's just books and papers, but actually if the students are not driving it and supporting it, it doesn't exist. That kind of epistemic infrastructure doesn't exist without a cohort of students as well as teachers. Andrea, we've got like two minutes, I think, maybe. So I'm sorry to make you do a short response, but if you can respond, and then I'll hand over to Srila to conclude.
Sorry, Andrea, also just to make your job even more difficult, maybe something around academic freedom in Brazil, because I mean, this is also so much on my mind when I think about what's happening in India. So again, just to make it much harder and to maybe, just to conclude, thanks.
I'll do my best here. Yeah. To respond to this question of gender mainstreaming, the risks, and of course the implications around academic freedom, I would have to speak from more than one Brazil. I'd have to speak of several Brazils, in a way kind of taking off from what Kathryn was saying. So there is a Brazil where gender mainstreaming exists. In academic and policy-oriented spaces, it's almost exclusively outward-facing and funded externally. And it takes as its point of reference the 3 waves of feminism and all of the US-centered languages and references. And I could go on to speak of these risks, but I'm going to put that in parentheses and speak from another Brazil where gender mainstreaming does not actually reverberate and does not constitute the fields of our disputes. And it's a Brazil where perhaps increasingly it's been getting into the international media, especially through the figure of our president, where there is a strong narrative dispute around what's been called a gender ideology. Yeah? And it's something I think that reverberates a lot with an experience of communism in different European contexts, because it always comes together. It's always communist gender ideology and LGTB as sort of the scapegoat in this narrative. And so in a way, all of this attention that's been given in the mass media and been legitimated by our presidency and vice presidency has actually given a lot more visibility to the idea of gender than before all of this anti-gender ideology. But this visibility is structured into an antagonistic role, right? Because for your doing gender ideology, which is what they essentially refer to as the corruption of and perversion, sexual perversion of children, the demise of the cis heteronormative family and so on, or you're on the other side. And so as we know, when we're kind of locked into this sort of extreme polarization, it becomes really difficult to change the terms of the conversation. So it's a different kind of challenge than gender mainstreaming. But because of the time, I won't get too much into that, but I will just put that there to sort of multiply a little bit the political imaginary. And for who's disputing within the academic institution, what we see is this total disconnect, right, from this broader context. And the ways that gender and feminism gets institutionalized, it's almost always as a theme. So there's a thematization of gender, which means that it doesn't have the capacity to be transversal. It doesn't have the capacity to implicate everyone in the conversation. So we have this experience that you always call those gender experts, talk about something. So you have to deal with a problem that emerged in the life of the university, violence or something. They call the gender experts, and no one else needs to get involved in the conversation. So one of the big conversations that's been happening in our disciplinary associations is whether or not to form gender studies thematic groups within our disciplinary associations, or continue to dispute all of the thematic groups and implicate everyone in a sort of a gendered lens. So there's lots to think about here, and I think really paying attention to these contours of the narrative dispute is one way of trying to realign our conversations to not get so caught up in sort of the disciplinary configuration of these dilemmas, and respond to how these dilemmas are taking up in the sort of political and social conjunctures.
Srila, I'm hoping that this discussion, with so many questions still to actually talk about, could be motivation to, in a future year ahead, when we're allowed to see each other in person, to motivate our generous funders to have a second, to have more Governing Intimacies workshops somewhere either in the Global South or perhaps even in the Middle East. But because who wants to travel to the Global North now anyway? I mean, hands up, anybody who wants to be in Britain, sorry, Kathryn, but or the United States right now is definitely, yeah. So I would really value the opportunity to continue these discussions. I think there's so much, it's because as this becomes a formalized enterprise, we have to conduct ourselves like formal enterprises, and we have to unfortunately learn the language that comes with that, which is how to manage the funders, how to manage the university itself, how to, anyway, so that's the challenge of project leads.
Quickly also, I think before Kath leaves, I just wanted to take us back to, I think, what Kathryn in fact said, which is that actually there has been no real imperative, external imperative that pushes us, literally, Andrea, Kat, Sara, to reach out to one another, to say, hey, let's have a collaboration. I mean, Andrea has been recently in touch with some colleagues in Brazil. And I just think that's so, I mean, it sounds banal to say this, but I find that so hugely optimistic that actually we're not doing this because there's some funder who says, reach out to someone in Lebanon and Brazil. On the contrary, they're saying pretty much the verse, but we're actually doing it because we're interested in each other's work, we're interested in each other's ideas, we're interested in the institutional locations. And, to go back to what Andrea just said, we're also deeply invested in our historical and political conjuncture, which is of crises, right? And it's of layered crises. And in a way, it is only through us that I think we can find that relief or that respite in thinking through this together. And so I suppose I want to end on that note of like how despondent that feels, but how incredibly energizing it is for me to think that it might be feminist friendship that fuels our collaborations and their eventual institutionalized life or failure, right? I mean, it's almost like, what have we got to lose? We're not going to disappoint any funder except just ourselves. So on that note, thank you so much for being here. I know there are everyday challenges like that bloody load shedding in Lebanon that I almost forgot about. But there are so many other things. So to take the time out, to come and think together, it takes a lot of energy, and we really, really see you value it and appreciate it. So thank you so much. And I think I speak for all of us when I say we've really learned a lot. Just before we end, since this is our last session, I just wanted to quickly thank everyone who's made this possible, starting with all our speakers. A lot of you have been part of the Governing Intimacies project, my immediate colleagues in India, our students. I think Noma's still there, or Noma's gone, but our students have, attended each one, have retweeted my tweets. So they've also really been part of the spirit of this series. Obviously, Kayo and Nehama, as I said, this was like the seed of this idea was Nehama's, but Kayo and Nehama have put in, again, amidst all sorts of everyday challenges and life in general, enormous energy in just getting it all together and making it look as slick as it does right now, but also in its recorded version. Kyle, big thanks to you for also all the beautiful posters. Eurisha, who is always just the poster, has been really the kind of glue that sticks it all and makes it all work. So thank you so much, Eurisha. I think you have enjoyed the conversations. I certainly hope you have. The Mellon Foundation for enabling the online and offline life of this project, and finally to our audience who have still today stuck on, even though we've gone over time. They've really, I know it hasn't been as interactive, and maybe next year, if COVID forces us to do this again, we'll try and do better. But yeah, thank you so much for being part of this conversation. I think it's fair to say, in a really super shitty year, this was quite nice, actually. It was really nice to do this every 2 weeks and just to have these conversations. So thanks everyone, and I'm so sorry again we've taken so much time. Okay.
Thanks to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Yeah. And it was very nice to meet you all.
It was. And
yes.
Hopefully Beirut in 2021, or we can come and visit you in South Africa.
I think given the currency situation, you probably have to visit us before our currency implodes, and then we'll visit you. Okay.
Thank you. So lovely to meet you all. Bye-bye.